Hello, I'm Deb Morgan and I'm from Not a Rehearsal, and I have the honour and privilege of interviewing some of the contributing authors to this incredible book, Revival: Women Embracing Their Superpowers. Now, I'm joined today by Clarissa Kristjansson, who is a menopause transition specialist at Clarissa Kristjansson Coaching. Now, Clarissa, you have an interesting story to tell, and certainly a lot of your story, from what I've read, revolves around a certain stage of every woman's life. You're a menopause coach. So tell me, why did you decide that that's what you wanted to focus on helping other women through?
Well, that's a great question, Deb. And really, I suppose, like so many women, I didn't know very much about this time of life. I thought, you got to somewhere in 50 and your period stopped, and that was kind of it. And heard a few stories, but it wasn't something that was happening in my social circle, not much discussion. And in my mid-40s, I went through a lot of personal trauma with a very significant divorce, which had resulted in homelessness and, a lot of upset alongside my mother passing away from Alzheimer's. And I think that kind of shocked the system into going haywire, So my endocrine system was up the creek, and I started to get blood pressure issues. I put on weight, but I was always quite active. I had a lot of anxiety, and that went on for many, many years. And I just lived with it. And I went to doctors and I got zero help, which isn't unusual either, that you would get zero help from a doctor. They kind of dismissed me, told me I was grossly overweight, even though I only weighed about 60 something kilos, and said, oh, here are some blood pressure meds, go away. And so that's very, very interesting that is how things kind of evolved. And it wasn't until much later that I realized, oh, this is perimenopause. Oh my goodness, that's what it's been all along. All this anxiety, this weight gain, this lack of sleep, compounded by stress.
So it's interesting that you came to that conclusion on your own. Had that not been discussed or raised at any other point before?
No, nobody had ever mentioned that to me, ever. And it wasn't until I started to sort of research myself and what I was going through, and really when I was writing my book, then all of this sort of came out. I was like, oh, wow. Oh, this is me. This is me. This is what's going on here. And that then said to me, no woman should have to go into this so unaware and so unsupported. And so that's how I became a menopause coach and mentor.
Okay. Now, in your story, you obviously say that for much of your life you were a yes woman. And going through your story, you get to a stage where you've got quite a senior position, and you recognize that menopause is basically causing you to burn out. But you didn't recognize that instantly, did you? I think it's with hindsight is what I picked up from your story. It's that you realized was causing the burnout. Can you describe that sort of process? I mean, many women in midlife are senior managers. They're dealing with the normal day-to-day things that all women deal with. And they're going through menopause or perimenopause. And you can talk to me about the correct terminology in a moment. But how did you deal with such a position of authority and responsibility? Then you've got all of the hormonal things going on. At what point did you put two and two together and realize that the menopause, the perimenopause, was impacting your ability to do your job?
Well, that really was a turning point. I actually changed job when I was 50. And I took on a much more senior role. And that dialed up the pressure for me. And I had a boss, and I don't talk about her in the book, but she was a micromanager to the nth degree. Look, she's the sort of person who sends you a messenger to tell you she's going to send you an email and then rings you after you've had the email.
Okay.
And so,
I think we've all had one of those.
We have had one of those. And I mean, it doesn't make the person a bad person. It just makes it that when you're managing a job where you're working across multiple geographies, there's a lot of pressure of delivery. I have a teenage child and my body's going haywire. And then I began to realize, look, this is not a sustainable way to live my life. But it happened really two incidences, which when I look back on them, I'm really quite shocked at the lack of action that I took. And one was that I was living in Sydney and I lived on a very steep hill. I mean, it is a steep hill. I mean, up Simpson Street was steep, but I couldn't get up the hill. I could barely breathe to get from the bottom of the hill back up to where I lived. And I was struggling all the way. And I'm thinking, this is not normal, you know, to struggle this much to walk. I mean, today I would walk up the hill without any problems. And that triggered me that I need to get this investigated. And then, in fact, I blacked out in the office in Clarence Street twice. I literally lost vision after a meeting. And I said to myself initially, oh yeah, it's the fluorescent lights, they're messing with my eyesight. But I somehow, you know, then thought, well, when it happened twice, it was extremely frightening actually to be in an office. People had left the meeting room and you couldn't see. And you couldn't get your vision back and you're blinking and you're taking off your glasses. You're thinking maybe it's my contact lenses, whatever it was. And that was clearly a sign that the body just couldn't take any more pressure. And so both of those made me rethink that I need to look at how I'm living my life because it's not sustainable. And brought me to, by accident, to be involved with mindfulness initially, but then moving into women's health coaching and mindset coaching, resilience, and those aspects, which had really been very missing from my life.
That's interesting. And I was going to ask you about that a little later on, but as we're there now, you talk about, and I've written it down, you're a third age women's health coach. What does that mean? What's the third age?
Really, the third age is perimenopause and beyond. Okay. So that would be called a third age women's health coach. So the way I coach, I don't coach younger women. So you come to me and you're a younger woman, yes, I can give you general advice, but my area of expertise is very much the impact that the changes in your hormones are making on the way in which we need to approach the way we move, the way we eat, the way we sleep, the way we think, because it's such a fundamental shift in our biology. And I don't think we realize that initially, you know, that we even need to look at the way we do certain types of exercise because our body may not be able to hold that intensity, that we may need to actually adjust our sleep through our monthly cycle. I mean, gosh, those things were a revelation to me and probably a revelation to a lot of women listening to this interview, that we need a very different approach to health coaching than a generalized one.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And it makes me wonder, very early on in your story in the book, you talk about your mum and you say that your mum was left, you know, in the mid-70s as a single mum when your dad went abroad to work. And all of a sudden she found herself as a single mum in the mid-70s when, you know, it wasn't as acceptable then by any stretch of the imagination as it is now. And were you ever aware, and you don't mention this, but were you ever aware that she might be having problems going through this same stage of life? Or is it something as you've got older, you've recognized, oh, that would explain certain instances, and you don't list them in the book? That's me making an assumption there and just asking generally, really.
Yeah, I think in the space we have in the book, we haven't probably got room to go into it, you know, my mum, but yes, she had extreme migraines at exactly what I would say is perimenopause. And she also had a lot of issues with her blood pressure, which of course women perimenopause and beyond do because of the change in our hormones. And both of those today we can look back on and said they would have been menopausal type issues that were not recognized at that time, and women are still to a certain extent struggling with.
That's really interesting.
You understand more. I mean, we're talking 40 years on, our biology has, our knowledge of what's going on has advanced tremendously. But then nobody said anything. to her. She was given some blood pressure meds eventually, and her migraines actually, interestingly, started to decline at about the time that hormones balance out. And she didn't have them later in life.
That's really interesting. And the fact you've been able to see that pattern looking back makes an awful lot of sense. And, I'm sure it would help so many women now. And I want to go on to the terminology, because you're using the term perimenopause. Lots of women talk about the menopause. I'm interested to get some clarity around the different terms. You're a menopause coach, so who better to ask than to outline and describe those terms with some clarity for the rest of us?
Yes, good question. So technically, the transition time when our hormones are fluctuating and declining is perimenopause.
Mm-hmm.
That's really that time. So that's the time that lasts for however many years it lasts, whether that's 3, 5, 10, 15, God help us. But that is perimenopause. The menopause itself, and that's a term I use because people understand it more than anything else to have clarity, is really one day, exactly 12 months since your last period. After that, you are a postmenopause woman. And then we're in a new phase of life.
Okay, so I'm thinking then that the nutrition needs and exercise needs and everything else of a woman at each of those stages is very different.
It can definitely be different. I think when we're going through that perimenopause change and there's so much fluctuation in our hormones, then we need to be very aware of that. We can very quickly become very tired. We have problems sleeping. We need to support ourselves, and we need to be making sure that we're balancing the estrogen and progesterone levels. A lot of the issues that women have in this time is due to something called estrogen dominance. So although there's not heaps of estrogen, it's so out of balance with the progesterone that it throws the body out of balance. So as we're going through that transition and before the body settles, we need to be managing our exercise and our diet accordingly to support the body to process and, quite honestly, excrete the excess estrogen effectively. Once we're in a different state, once we've gone through our menopause, then we've got a new level, which is a low level of estrogen and progesterone. That in itself requires us to be really mindful that we don't allow those levels to dip too low, because it puts us at risk of more heart disease, more osteoporosis, brain function, etc. Because estrogen is hugely important in so many of our health-related aspects. So we need to be really protecting what we've got.
I like that. And you talk in your book, I've made a note here, that you say that menopause is an emotional, mental, and spiritual transition. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for me? Because I think that's fantastic, and it suggests to me it's really a holistic transition in the true meaning of the term holistic, So can you elaborate on that for me?
Yes, I can. I think, first of all, it is a change in the way that we are, in ourselves. We have left behind those years of when we are a fertile woman. We're not going to produce any more children. And that can be, for some women, a big emotional journey. Our children also grow up. And if you have children and they go away, well, you go, I'm an empty nester. But that isn't like woohoo all the time. There's that changing relationships. It's a time when we question ourselves. Where am I? What's my purpose in life? Do I want to spend the next 15 years working at this job? So there is a lot of questioning that's at a very deep emotional level around this time particularly, and the way in which society views us changes. Mm. And so that also brings into that dimension of who am I as a woman? How am I showing up in the world? And how is this, with society and against it? And I think we're shaping new identities for ourselves at this time. becoming this, and I think increasingly a strong, outspoken older women. We aren't having our mother's menopause. We are not our mothers or our grandparents. And I'm about to turn 60, and I mean, I'm very different from my mother, who would have been very different from her mother. And so we're not accepting appalling images of women if we look at them at this life stage. I mean, they're not nice. And they're not how we are as women. And so I think we're in a phase now where we're reclaiming, this is my wise woman space. I've got a lot to give this world. I've got a lot of what the anthropologist Margaret Mead called postmenopausal zest. And she termed that a long time ago, but this is drive we have. And yeah, I love it too. And we have drive and we have energy and vitality, and we're not ready to give up on that yet. So I think that is the whole journey. It's the wholeness of becoming a new woman again, and a wiser woman with so much to give.
This is really interesting, because you've spoken a lot about wisdom and wise women, and how that wisdom comes with age and maturity. And I've been fortunate enough to interview a number of the co-authors of this book, one of whom was Sharon Brown, who is the founder of Revival Sanctuary. And she was talking about sharing women's wisdom, and that was one of her drivers and motivators. So I'm interested to know, because you're part of this book, because you're a member of Revival Sanctuary, what was it that drew you to Revival Sanctuary and drew you to take up the opportunity of sharing your wisdom to other women?
You know, it for me was the first female group that I'd seen out there that was truly about collaboration. And I think that has been the wonderful thing, and remains the wonderful thing about Revival Sanctuary. We're not here for one-upmanship. We're not here to compete with each other, but we are working in new ways. And I think that an opportunity to tell your story is part of that, because telling your story is allowing other women to feel that they're not alone in what they're going through. Because I think a lot of us are plowing along, often, managing what we're managing inside our space. And sharing stories opens up that there's this sense of connection between us, and that we can learn, and we can see that we can all learn and grow. And whatever our adversity, and I look at my story and I've seen some other people's stories, and I'm like, some people's stories are just really tough, but they've come through it. And I think that's what Revival Sanctuary is about, that collaborative process and learning from each other.
Fantastic. And I'd agree with you wholeheartedly there. And I'd like to sort of wrap things up now on something you said in your story, which just struck a chord with me. And I thought, what a way to live. I really like this. And you said, after years and years of being a yes girl throughout your young life, throughout your career, you now show up in the world perfectly imperfect as you. How did you get to that point?
I think that I started to love myself. And that was the hardest journey, when people said to me, oh, what did you go through in the journey? And there was compassion. We had a big part on that. There was a big part on training about compassion, self-compassion, compassion for others, as I went through my mindfulness training. And if I can tell the story, it was quite amusing, because I have a wonderful mentor based in Ireland. Karen is an amazing human being. And she turns to me very, very directly and says, did you skip over that bit on compassion then? Or did you not have time to finish it? And I was like, no, I did all the exercises, compliant as I sometimes am. And she said, well, I don't think you have. She said, oh, something's really missing here, she said to me. That was that moment that it struck me that I hadn't yet really learnt what it was like to love myself. Mm-hmm. And when you love yourself, you can be imperfect in many different ways. We're not perfect beings, and it doesn't matter. Perfectionism isn't a goal, but it was something that I had the pressure. I've always felt the pressure that I wasn't quite good enough. I had to be a bit more perfect and work at it. Now I'm just me, and you have to take me as I am, because actually I love myself and I make my life and changes in order to do that.
That's fantastic. And I'm picking up a theme here across a number of the interviews that I've done now. And it strikes me that women get to this stage in life. They may be perimenopausal, but with all of that angst and that difficulty comes an acceptance and an awareness that this is who I am, and actually I've done okay. I love me, I like me, and you know what? I'm not changing me for anybody. I will grow, I will develop, but I'm not going to change the core of me for anyone. And you also hit on something in your story as well about comparison. You've just mentioned it a little just now, that you spent a lot of time comparing yourself to other people and not feeling good enough. And I feel in what you've just said, and again in the other interviews I've done, in lots of the stories in this book, women have come through almost this rite of passage where they've gone through the 20s and 30s, they've gone through those heady delights of life, and as they hit midlife, they're going into perimenopause, they're starting to question, who am I? What is there in life? There's got to be more to life than this. And to get to a stage to say, you know what? No, I just show up perfectly imperfect is absolutely fantastic. I'd be so bold as to suggest that that is one of the biggest pieces of wisdom you could share with anybody. Just be perfectly imperfect.
Exactly.
Clarissa, it's been absolutely fantastic speaking to you. Thank you so much. I have learned so much about perimenopause. I've learned so much about just learning to love myself. Thank you for that. Thank you so much for your contribution to the book, to Revival, Women Embracing Their Superpowers. It's available on Amazon, or you can get it at revivalsanctuary.co.uk, and please tune in as I interview a number of the authors of this book over the coming weeks. Thank you very much. Thank you, Clarissa.
Thank you, Deb.